April 1945. The grand cities, which had once echoed with triumphant parades, now lay smoldering beneath a gray and boundless sky. Roads, once arteries of commerce, were choked with a silent procession of refugees and weary soldiers. Amidst this pervasive chaos, the final defense of a collapsing regime was not manned by seasoned warriors, but by mere boys. Their helmets were too large, their rifles too heavy, and the profound fear in their eyes was a burden no uniform could possibly conceal. Across a landscape scarred by 1,000 shattered fields, these young members of the Hitler Youth, often barely more than children, desperately dug shallow trenches. They waited for an army they had been ceaselessly told would show them no quarter. Among them was 13-year-old Hans, his face still retaining the soft contours of childhood innocence. His hands trembled as he gripped a Panzerfaust, crouching behind a crumbling stone wall on the outskirts of a ruined Bavarian village. Around him, other boys coughed in the cold, misty air, their breath rising like fragile, pale ghosts. They had been indoctrinated with horrifying tales. The Americans, they were assured, would burn them alive, hang them, or enslave them. Their officers, gaunt and desperate, bellowed exhortations about honor and fatherland. But honor felt like a hollow whisper when the ground began to vibrate ominously beneath the inexorable advance of tank treads. The sound reached them first, a low, distant thunder rumbling over the hills. Then came the metallic clatter, the rhythmic growl of powerful engines drawing ever closer. The boys' eyes widened with stark terror. Someone whispered, "They're here." A few clutched their grenades, holding them as if they were rosaries, seeking a desperate solace. Hans pressed his back against the rough stone, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pictured his mother, somewhere amidst the rubble of Munich, waiting for a son who might never return. He longed to be brave, to believe his school teacher's fervent sermons that dying for the Führer was a child's highest duty. Yet he couldn't stop shaking. When the first Sherman tank emerged through the acrid smoke, the boys unleashed a wild, desperate volley of fire. Their shots pinged uselessly off its formidable armor. The tank advanced relentlessly, undeterred. A stark white star gleamed on its turret, a strangely clean emblem against the ash-laden air. Behind it marched men in brown coats, calm, methodical, their rifles held low. An officer raised a hand, shouting something in English. Hans didn't understand the words, but an instinct deeper and older than any propaganda screamed at him to run. Beside him, a boy no older than 12 rose, grenade in hand, ready to throw. The blast from the tank's cannon roared first. It wasn't aimed at them, striking a nearby wall instead, but the sheer force of the explosion knocked them flat. Hans's ears rang with a deafening cacophony, and dust filled his mouth. When the smoke finally cleared, he saw the boy lying utterly still, a dark stain of blood spreading on the stones. The other boys broke. Their fragile line collapsed, rifles clattering into the mud. Some cried, some fled in panic disarray. Hans stumbled to his feet, let his weapon fall, and raised his empty hands in surrender. The Americans approached cautiously. They were bigger, louder, yet strangely, unmistakably human. One soldier, a man with a reddish beard and weary eyes, motioned for Hans to come forward. Hans hesitated, braced for a bullet. Instead, the soldier pulled a chocolate bar from his pocket, unwrapped it, and gently placed it in the boy's trembling hand. Chocolate, sweet, rich, impossibly real. Hans bit into it and tears welled up. He had utterly forgotten such a taste could exist. Across the ravaged Bavarian countryside, countless scenes just like this unfolded. Columns of frightened teenagers surrendered to the very men they had been taught to despise. Some still tried to fight, fueled by fanaticism. Others simply collapsed in overwhelming relief. American medics, who had braced themselves for hardened killers, instead found malnourished children riddled with lice, suffering from frostbite, and possessing eyes far too old for their young faces. They bandaged wounds, offered water, and called them kid. The irony was stark and brutal. These boys had marched under the banner of a 1,000-year empire, and now they could barely stand. In one makeshift camp outside Nuremberg, U.S. soldiers rounded up hundreds of young recruits, many under 15. The Americans searched them with unexpected gentleness, wary of booby traps, only to discover most pockets held nothing but marbles and half-eaten crusts of bread. Chaplain Captain Lutz recorded in his diary that night, "They were little more than ghosts. One boy saluted me and asked if I was going to shoot him. When I said no, he cried until he fell asleep." For the Americans, the war was nearing its end. For these boys, it felt like the complete dissolution of their world. Everything they had believed, every poster, every lesson, every impassioned speech, was unraveling before their eyes. They had been told that Allied soldiers were inhuman demons, that surrender meant ultimate disgrace, that the Führer would never abandon them. Yet here were these very enemies, offering them warm soup and blankets, speaking softly as if to their own sons. That night, Hans sat in a captured barn with 20 other boys. The Americans had lit a stove, and the comforting scent of stew filled the air. Steam rose invitingly from tin bowls. Hans watched the red-bearded soldier, Sergeant Miller, ladle broth into each bowl, a faint smile playing on his lips, as if serving his own family. Hans didn't understand Miller's words, but the tone, calm, undeniably fatherly, was unmistakable. He felt a fragile, unfamiliar warmth flicker within him. Outside, the last artillery rounds boomed in the distance, echoing like a dying heartbeat of the old world. Inside, the boys ate in profound silence. Some stared at the floor, perhaps in shame. Others devoured their food with trembling hands. Hans took a second bite, then a third, feeling life returning to his numb tongue. He remembered his father, fallen on the Eastern Front, and wondered if the man before him, the enemy who had spared his life, might have sons his own age back in America. As the stove crackled, one of the younger boys whispered, "Do you think they'll let us go home?" Another answered, "If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead already." The words hung in the air like dissipating smoke. For the very first time, Hans realized the war might genuinely end, and that survival would entail the daunting task of unlearning everything he had been taught. Later, as the soldiers led them toward a more established makeshift camp, Hans glanced back at the horizon. The sky glowed faintly red where Nuremberg burned, a testament to the empire his teachers had sworn would last forever, now reduced to dust and flame. Yet, as he walked among his captors, he felt something entirely new and unfamiliar. Safety. The Americans routinely searched their pockets for weapons, but instead found only childish trifles. Crude drawings, stray buttons, a cherished photograph of a mother. One GI carefully lifted a torn picture from Hans's coat pocket, a woman smiling gently beside a small boy. The soldier studied it for a moment, then, with profound care, handed it back. "You'll see her again," he said quietly. Hans didn't understand the exact words, but the profound kindness in the voice was unmistakable. He nodded, holding the picture close. In that pivotal moment, a strange reversal took root. A war built on hatred was, paradoxically, giving birth to acts of profound mercy. The Americans, weary and homesick, began to see their own sons reflected in the defeated faces of their young enemies. The German boys, indoctrinated for fanaticism, encountered compassion that utterly shattered every lie they had ever been told. When night fell, the camp lights shimmered over the barbed wire fences and rows of sleeping forms wrapped in army blankets. Somewhere in the dark, Hans whispered a word he hadn't spoken in months. "Mama." The soldier on watch looked over, then tossed another blanket Hans's way. The boy pulled it close, breathing in the faint scent of soap and tobacco. He didn't know it yet, but that night was the beginning of something far grander than mere surrender. It was the first tentative step toward rediscovery, toward realizing that the men who had conquered them had not come to destroy, but to gently remind them what it truly meant to be human. As dawn crept over the ruined fields, the fog slowly lifted, and the distant church bells, silent for weeks, began to ring once more. The boys stirred, blinking in the pale morning light. Some even smiled without understanding why. Far beyond the camp fences, carried on the wind from the direction of home, a new sound emerged. Not gunfire, not martial songs, but the fragile, hopeful hum of peace beginning to breathe again. Hans stared toward it, clutching the blanket around his shoulders. The Americans had spared his life, but what he could not yet fully grasp was that they were about to do something far more powerful. They were going to give it meaning. The gentle spring rain fell softly over Bavaria, washing the soot from rooftops and the last lingering symbols of a dying empire. The war was unequivocally over, but the children of that war were not. Across the countryside, trucks rattled toward makeshift camps, each one filled with boys who had, only days or weeks before, been soldiers. Some still wore the tattered remnants of their uniforms. Hitler Youth insignias, torn armbands, badges for a bravery no one remembered awarding. Now stripped of their weapons, they sat shoulder to shoulder, too small for the weight of their collective guilt, too quiet for their age. Among them sat Hans, 13, watching the rain-filmed hills roll by. The rifle that had once defined him was gone. In its place, he held an empty canteen, a silent keepsake from another, vanished life. When the convoy eventually stopped at a field camp outside Würzburg, the boys were ordered to disembark. American soldiers, their raincoats glistening, guided them toward rows of canvas tents. The air hung heavy with the smell of wet hay and gasoline. The boys braced themselves for harshness, for shouts, for punishment, for humiliation. But the tone was calm, almost routine. "You'll get food soon," one soldier said, his German clumsy but undeniably kind. Another offered them cigarettes. None of the boys knew how to refuse. They were too preoccupied trying to reconcile the bewildering reality before them. The enemy laughing, the enemy helping, the enemy behaving like ordinary men rather than the monsters of propaganda. Inside the camp, army medics examined them one by one. Some of the younger boys flinched instinctively at the touch. Others stared blankly as doctors cleaned their wounds. A nurse, her uniform crisp despite the omnipresent mud, knelt to bandage a scraped knee. "Too young," she murmured softly in English. Hans didn't understand the words, but her voice carried a profound, maternal warmth. He felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with hunger. By evening, the boys were gathered in a mess tent that smelled of rich broth and soap. Tin plates clattered as a soldier ladled thick, vegetable-laden stew into each bowl. For many, it was the first real meal they had eaten in weeks. Hans hesitated before taking his first bite. He remembered lessons about poisoned rations, propaganda leaflets warning that surrender meant a treacherous death. But the stew's comforting warmth slowly broke through his fear. He took one cautious spoonful, then another. Around him, heads were bowed not in salute, but in silent, stunned disbelief. As night fell, the camp settled under a quilt of mist. The boys were issued blankets, dry clothes, and, astonishingly, fresh socks. They slept in neat rows, their breathing steady, punctuated by soft murmurs and nascent dreams. Outside, American sentries smoked by lantern light, their hushed conversations drifting toward home. Texas, Ohio, Kansas. Hans listened through the tent flap, catching only fragments. Wife, boy, baseball. The words felt foreign, yet strangely soothing. Days blurred into a new rhythm of order and unexpected mercy. The children were deloused, vaccinated, and given bars of soap, luxuries they hadn't known in years. Some stared at the soap as if it were pure gold. The Americans simply called them kids, a word both unfamiliar and disarmingly simple. It carried no rank, no obligation, no ideology. Just a quiet acceptance that they were no longer soldiers. One morning, Chaplain Lutz visited the camp. He was a middle-aged man with spectacles that perpetually slid down his nose and a Bible worn smooth from extensive use. He gathered the boys under a large oak tree and spoke in simple, carefully chosen German. "The war is over," he declared. "You are safe now." The statement fell over them like sudden sunlight after an endless rain. Some of the older boys looked away, unwilling to display their relief. Others wept openly. Hans stared at the chaplain, unsure whether to believe him. Safety was a concept that felt almost mythical. Later that day, Sergeant Miller returned, the same red-bearded man who had first offered Hans chocolate. He brought with him a crate of supplies, apples, notebooks, and something that made the entire camp erupt with joyous laughter: baseballs. The GIs quickly cleared a patch of ground and began showing the boys how to throw and catch. Awkward arms flailed, laughter rang out, and for a precious moment, the brutal realities of war dissolved into the simplicity of a game. Hans stood at the edge, hesitant. Miller tossed him a worn glove. "Try," he said. Hans caught the ball clumsily, dropping it with a thud. The sergeant grinned. "Good. Now again." It was the first time anyone had encouraged him without shouting. As the days warmed, the camp began to transform. The barbed wire fences no longer felt like prison walls, but rather like boundaries between a traumatic past and something uncertainly, hopefully better. Some boys began helping in the kitchen, slowly learning English phrases. "Thank you, good soup. My name is." When Red Cross volunteers arrived, they brought books, crayons, and small wooden toys. One nurse, a woman from Illinois, noticed Hans sketching on a scrap of paper and found him a fresh notebook. "For your thoughts," she said. He didn't know the word thoughts, but he understood the compassionate gesture. Each act of kindness confused them as much as it comforted them. These were the very same Americans who had bombed their towns, who had crushed the army they had been taught to worship. How could such victors be so gentle? One boy, bold enough, asked Miller why they were being treated so well. The sergeant paused, then answered simply, "Because you're kids, and kids deserve a chance to grow up." The words lingered long after he left, echoing in their minds. Not all moments were easy. Some of the boys still whispered Hitler's name at night, afraid of betraying their deep-seated indoctrination. A few drew swastikas in the dirt, only for American soldiers to quietly, meticulously wash them away. Lutz gathered them again, explaining that symbols could die, but people could live differently. "Hate is learned," he said, "and so is love." It wasn't a sermon. It was a lifeline. Hans began to change almost imperceptibly. He no longer flinched when spoken to. He started sharing his food, even laughed at the soldiers' jokes, and mimicked their American accents. In the evenings, he and the others sang along to a scratchy radio that played American songs. Strange, melodic tunes about faraway places like Tennessee and Chicago. The boys didn't understand the lyrics, but the music carried a powerful promise of normalcy. One night, Miller sat beside Hans by the campfire, polishing his boots. "You remind me of my son," he said softly. Hans didn't catch the full meaning, but when Miller gently ruffled his hair, he smiled shyly. It was the first fatherly gesture he had felt since his own father's death. Something within him, hard and small as a stone, began to crack. By June, many of the boys were transferred to larger rehabilitation camps. Some were destined to be sent home, others would remain longer for recovery and schooling. The Americans ensured they carried warm clothes, food rations, and official papers certifying their release. Before their departure, Chaplain Lutz gathered them one last time. "Remember," he said, "the world you knew is gone, but you can choose what kind of men you'll become." As the trucks lined up, Hans looked back at the camp. The familiar tents, the sturdy oak tree, the men who had fed and, in a profound sense, forgiven them. In the distance, Miller raised a hand. Hans waved back, clutching the baseball glove the sergeant had given him. He didn't know the word for gratitude, but he felt it deep in his chest, sharp and utterly overwhelming. As the convoy rolled toward the horizon, the boys sat silently, watching the landscape blur and recede. The physical fences of captivity were now behind them, but something unexpected had taken root inside them. A seed of belonging, fragile yet vibrantly alive. They were still orphans of a lost war, but for the first time they were also children again. What none of them knew, as the wind whipped across the truck beds, was that years later, many would still write to the men and women of those camps, their letters beginning not with "Dear Sir," but with "Dear Father" and "Dear Mother." For though their war had ended, their longing for family had only just begun. The summer sun hung low over Bavaria, warm and golden against a land still haunted by the ashes of war. By July 1945, the camps no longer smelled of smoke and iron, but of fresh bread baking and laundry drying in the gentle breeze. The boys, once shadowy figures in uniform, had grown into something almost recognizable as youth. Yet, beneath their tentative laughter, there still lingered a profound confusion, a quiet disbelief that such mercy could follow such unimaginable horror. For Hans, the sheer shock of sustained kindness had become its own unique kind of battle. Every morning began the same way. The clatter of tin bowls, the distant call of a bugle, the low hum of men speaking in English. Hans stood in line with the other boys, his stomach growling as the mess sergeant poured porridge into his bowl. "Eat up, kid," the man would say. Hans would nod, softly mimicking the word, "kid." He had learned its meaning now. It wasn't an insult. It was a gentle reminder that he was no longer a soldier. The camp itself had visibly changed. Small gardens sprouted near the barracks. The Red Cross had sent a bounty of books and paper. Some of the boys drew pictures. Others eagerly learned simple English phrases. A blackboard had been nailed to the wall of an old stable, where a kind-eyed nurse named Evelyn patiently taught them to write their names. She smelled faintly of soap and lilac, a scent so gentle that Hans sometimes found himself breathing deeply when she passed. When she smiled, the boys momentarily forgot that the world had ever been cruel. But not all could accept this new reality. One afternoon, Carl, a thin 16-year-old with sharp, distrustful eyes, refused to join the others for a lesson. "They're mocking us," he muttered in German. "They want us to forget who we are." Hans didn't answer. He desperately wanted to believe otherwise, but the thought gnawed at him. Were they truly being re-educated or genuinely rescued? The line between the two blurred like the distant horizon after a summer rain. Later that day, the Americans held a small ceremony under the venerable oak tree. The chaplain read aloud a letter from the U.S. Army Command. "All child combatants are to be treated as victims of war, not perpetrators." The words rolled over the gathered crowd like a melody none of them had ever heard. Victims, not enemies. The boys looked at one another, uncertain how to carry such a label. Victims were weak. They had been rigorously trained to despise weakness. Yet, standing there in clean shirts and with full bellies, they began to realize that perhaps this very weakness had kept them alive. After the reading, Sergeant Miller appeared with a basket of apples. He handed them out, tossing one to each boy. "Peace tastes better than gunpowder," he joked, and a ripple of cautious laughter followed. Hans bit into his apple, juice running down his chin, and for a fleeting heartbeat, he was just a boy again. Then he remembered his mother, perhaps starving amidst the ruins of Munich, and felt a pang of guilt for the sweetness. That night, thunder rolled over the hills, and heavy rain swept across the camp. The boys huddled inside their barracks, listening to the storm. Evelyn came in, carrying a lantern and extra blankets. "Stay warm," she said, her German halting but kind. Hans watched her kneel beside a sick boy, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. The flickering lantern light framed her face, making her seem almost holy. For so long, The only tenderness they had ever known came with conditions. Obedience, ideological fervor, or fear. Now it came freely, and it unsettled them more deeply than violence ever had. The next morning, the storm passed, leaving puddles that perfectly mirrored the sky. The camp buzzed with a quiet, new energy. Miller and two other soldiers set up a makeshift outdoor kitchen, allowing the boys to help stir pots and wash dishes. "If you can fight," Miller said with a smile, "you can cook." The boys laughed, proud to be useful. The comforting smell of stew drifted through the air, mingling with the sharp scent of wet pine. Hans stirred a pot for a long moment, lost in thought. Miller came up behind him. "Back home, my kid burns everything," he said with a grin. Hans smiled shyly, not understanding all the words, but sensing their warmth. Miller handed him a small, faded photograph. A boy of about 10 standing proudly beside a golden retriever. "My son," he explained. "He's waiting for me." Hans studied the picture. The boy's smile was open, unguarded, innocent. It looked like a different world entirely. Miller then pointed at Hans, then back at the photo, saying softly, "Same age." The simple gesture pierced deeper than any speech. Hans nodded, the corners of his mouth trembling with emotion. Days turned into weeks, and these small acts of kindness multiplied. Soldiers shared their precious rations of chocolate. Nurses gently braided the younger boy's hair. The chaplain organized soccer games on Sundays. Laughter became commonplace, hesitant at first, then steady, like an engine that had finally caught its spark. Yet, beneath the surface, a subtle guilt still pulsed. How could they accept such kindness from those they'd been told were their destroyers? One evening, a radio broadcast echoed across the camp. President Truman's voice announcing the official end of hostilities in the Pacific. The Americans cheered, tossing their hats into the air in joyous celebration. The German boys watched, uncertain whether to join. Hans stood at the edge, his hands clenched. The sound of victory, someone else's victory, felt like both an ending and a beginning. Evelyn noticed him and knelt down. "It's over," she whispered. "No more war." Hans looked up, his eyes wet. "For us too?" he asked in halting English. "For everyone," she affirmed. The next day, a Red Cross truck arrived, bringing mail and much-needed supplies. Some boys received letters from surviving relatives. Others received nothing but a heartbreaking silence. Hans's name was never called. That night, he sat alone by the fence, staring up at the vast canopy of stars. Miller joined him, offering a piece of bread spread with peanut butter. "No letter?" he asked gently. Hans shook his head. "Family gone?" The soldier nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. "Then you've got one here, kid." He said it casually, almost offhand, but the words struck Hans like a thunderclap in his chest. For days afterward, the boy repeated them in his mind. "You've got one here." It was a sentence that redefined his entire world. He began helping more, laughing easier, even teasing the Americans with his broken English. When Evelyn later saw him patiently teaching another young boy to articulate "please" and "thank you," a soft smile touched her lips. "You're a truly good teacher," she observed. Hans, caught in the act, shrugged with a blush, a flicker of his old self, yet now tempered with new confidence. "Good student first," he humbly countered, acknowledging his own transformation. Yet, even as a fragile peace settled, the indelible scars of the past remained. Periodically, visitors would arrive, stern officers conducting inspections, diligent journalists meticulously taking notes, and Red Cross officials quietly documenting the camp's residents. During one such visit, a man inquired about Hans's aspirations for adulthood. Hans hesitated, searching for the right words, then uttered in his still halting English, "Kind." The man offered a polite smile, utterly oblivious to the profound weight embedded in that single word. For Hans, kindness had been the most potent weapon, the silent force that had disarmed his fear and shattered his prejudices. A quiet revolution no ideology had ever prepared him for. By late summer, the camp's fences had become little more than symbolic boundaries, their watchful purpose largely diminished. The guards no longer maintained their strict vigilance. Some boys ventured into nearby villages, offering their small hands to help rebuild war-torn homes. They would return with enchanting tales of generous farmers sharing fresh milk and of children playing freely, unburdened by fear. Even so, whenever Hans passed through the gate, he would instinctively glance back. The camp, once a harrowing cage, had evolved into something almost sacred to him, a unique sanctuary where former enemies had chosen, by simple acts of humanity, to rediscover their own. One tranquil evening, as the sun began to melt into the distant hills, Sergeant Miller gathered his men. "We're being reassigned," he announced, his voice carrying a mix of news. "The boys will go home soon." Cheers erupted from the American soldiers, a sound of relief and anticipation. But among the German children, a profound silence fell, heavy and disquieting. Home. The word itself no longer carried the same meaning for them. For Hans, home was now wherever he had felt safe, wherever someone had remembered his name. As dusk deepened, he sought out Miller, who was by a truck, diligently loading crates. "You go?" Hans inquired, his voice soft. The sergeant nodded slowly. "Tomorrow morning." Hans paused, then reached into his pocket, pulling out the well-worn baseball glove he had received weeks ago. He pressed it gently into Miller's calloused hand. "For your boy," he said, barely a whisper. Miller's eyes glistened, a silent acknowledgement of the deep sentiment. "He'll know who it's from." When dawn painted the sky with hues of rose and gold, the trucks rumbled out through the camp gate. The boys stood watching, a silent, somber line, until the faint hum of the engines finally faded into the vast horizon. In the profound stillness that followed, Hans felt a strange ache bloom in his chest. It wasn't exactly loss, but rather a profound recognition. These men, who had once been his conquerors, had somehow become the very embodiment of everything good he aspired to be. He looked down at his own hands, clean, steady, vibrantly alive. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell softly chimed. For the first time, his thoughts strayed from war or gnawing hunger. Instead, he thought of kindness, and how simultaneously terrifying and miraculously transformative it had been to be saved by it. The war had concluded months prior, yet its echoes still resonated through the soft hum of post-war Europe, the clatter of frantic rebuilding, the hollow spaces where fathers and sons should have been, and the quiet, almost hopeful scraping of pencils on paper. It all began with one unassuming letter. In October 1945, nestled within a refugee shelter near Stuttgart, a 13-year-old boy named Hans borrowed a worn stub of a pencil and a precious sheet of Red Cross stationery. He stared at the blank page for nearly an hour, gathering his courage, before finally inscribing in uneven English, "Dear Sergeant Miller, I hope you are safe. I am good boy now. Thank you for the blanket. I sleep warm." He folded it with painstaking care, sealed it with trembling hands, and entrusted it to a nurse who promised to send it overseas. He couldn't have known then, but his small act of gratitude would become the first trickle in a burgeoning flood of letters, hundreds upon hundreds pouring out of a broken nation, addressed to the men and women who had once been its formidable conquerors. In towns scattered across Germany, the former child soldiers were painstakingly trying to recall how to simply live. Some returned to find their families utterly gone, their houses reduced to desolate stone shells. Others wandered aimlessly between orphanages and farms, a desperate search for a familiar face that no longer existed. The Americans, long since redeployed home, had gradually receded into distant memory. Yet, their unexpected kindness had lodged deep within the children's hearts, like a resilient seed patiently awaiting spring. And when the Red Cross extended its offer to facilitate overseas correspondence, the children eagerly began to write. They wrote in halting English and shaky German, sometimes blending both languages within the same sentence. One letter read, "Dear Mama Evelyn, I learned school again." Another, perhaps more poignantly, offered, "Dear Captain Lutz, I pray now before E." Like you say, these humble letters often carried small, cherished treasures, pressed wildflowers, rough charcoal sketches, or photographs painstakingly clipped from newspapers. They spoke of ordinary miracles, warm meals, the serene quiet of peace, the strange, almost forgotten sensation of laughter returning to their throats. Postal clerks, accustomed to sorting endless wartime mail, affectionately dubbed them the thank you letters. But for many of the boys, they were something far more profound, a fragile bridge back to the concept of family itself. In Kansas, Sergeant Miller's wife discovered Hans's letter nestled among a bundle of veterans' mail. She called out to her husband, who was in the backyard mending a fence. As he carefully opened the envelope, the handwriting was unmistakably childish, the sentences disarmingly simple. But halfway down the page, he stopped, his gaze fixed, and read aloud. "You say, 'I have family here.' I think may be true." Miller slowly folded the letter, his eyes drifting towards the distant horizon. That evening, he penned a reply. "Dear Hans, I'm glad you are safe. You always had a home here. My boy asks about you. He says when he grows up, he wants to play baseball with you." Over the next several years, these letters traversed the vast ocean like small, vital lifelines. The boys matured, their handwriting grew steadier, their English more confident. Hans wrote of working on a farm just outside Augsburg, how the comforting smell of freshly baked bread now reminded him of the camp kitchens, and of the first peaceful Christmas he spent without a hint of fear. He always signed each note, "Your German son, Hans." Miller meticulously kept all of them in a small tin box, the metal worn smooth from countless openings and closings. Other soldiers did the same. In Illinois, Nurse Evelyn received Christmas cards for nearly a decade from boys who affectionately addressed her as Mama or Aunt. One card included a faded black and white photograph. 3 young men standing proudly before a newly rebuilt school, smiling somewhat awkwardly for the camera. On the back, a message was scrawled. "You teach us how to read. We teach others now." She lovingly pinned it to her kitchen wall, right beside a cherished photo of her own children. When curious visitors inquired about the young men in the picture, she would simply say, "My other sons." In 1951, a small feature article appeared in the Stars and Stripes newspaper, recounting these extraordinary correspondences, how former German child soldiers, once declared enemies, had become devoted pen pals to the very soldiers who had captured them. The article quoted one particularly poignant letter that read, "You were the first people who were kind to me. I thought you would kill me, but you made me a boy again." The story spread quietly, a gentle ripple shared in veterans' halls and Sunday sermons, a rare spark of unexpected grace in a decade otherwise shadowed by the nascent Cold War. For Hans, the letters became a cherished ritual. Every spring, he would write to the Millers. He shared milestones, securing his first real job, buying a bicycle, planting apple trees behind his small house. And he always concluded every note in the same way. "Thank you for teaching me that the enemy can be good." One winter, a package arrived in return. A baseball signed by Miller's son, now a teenager. Inside was a handwritten note. "You're part of our team, no matter how far away you are." Years rolled on, marked by the slow, fragmented healing of Europe. Factories hummed to life, borders subtly shifted, and the children of war themselves became fathers. But the letters never ceased. Even decades later, some continued to arrive, yellowed and creased with age, penned in careful, sometimes shaky script that began with "Dear Mom" or "Dear Dad." Archivists who discovered these correspondences within veterans' estates were often startled by their profound tenderness. One historian would later write, "These correspondences revealed something extraordinary. that mercy had accomplished what no treaties ever could. It had rewritten loyalty. In 1960, Hans finally saved enough money to realize a lifelong dream, a journey to America. He embarked on a ship across the vast Atlantic, clutching a worn photograph of Sergeant Miller. When he arrived in New York Harbor, he felt a powerful surge of both terror and vibrant aliveness. The ensuing train journey to Kansas was long, the passing landscape utterly unfamiliar. But when he stepped off at a small, unassuming station, he saw an older man waiting, broad-shouldered, with a kindly gray beard, wearing the same easy smile that had once offered him a baseball glove. They did not speak at first. They simply stood there, absorbing the moment, until Miller pulled him into a warm, encompassing embrace. "Welcome home, son," Miller said, his voice thick with emotion. They spent that week together on the porch, patiently piecing together the narratives of their lives. Miller showed him the tin box of letters, still meticulously preserved. Hans, in turn, shared a photograph of his own family. A loving wife, 2 children, one named Charles. "After you," he explained, a proud smile on his face. Miller blinked back tears, a deep sigh escaping him. "Guess we both did all right," he said softly. When Hans eventually returned to Germany, he carried far more than mere souvenirs. He carried the profound realization that nations could fall, but kindness, enduring and unwavering, could transcend even the most rigid borders. The boy who had once believed enemies were monstrous now held a far simpler, more profound truth: that goodness, when offered without expectation or demand, could survive even the utter ruins of ideology. In later years, as old soldiers quietly passed away, museums began the sacred task of collecting their correspondence. Boxes of letters, faded and fragile, were displayed under glass, mute but powerful testimonies of a generation who learned peace not from grand speeches, but from the simple, transformative power of human touch. One exhibit bore a profoundly simple title: From Captives to Children. Hans visited once, standing quietly before his own letters, his reflection merging with the glass, his youthful handwriting hovering like a gentle ghost beside his aging face. A small boy nearby innocently asked if he had truly been one of those children. "Yes," Hans replied, a faint smile playing on his lips. "But I was lucky. I met people who showed me what family meant." The child nodded, not fully comprehending, and then ran back to his mother. As the museum lights began to dim, Hans lingered a moment longer. In the deepening silence, he imagined Miller's voice, steady and warm. "You've got one here, kid." It echoed through time, a promise faithfully kept. Outside, the evening sun touched the roofs of the new Germany, bright, unscarred, alive with promise. He looked up at it, his eyes shining, whispering a word that still felt wonderfully foreign on his tongue: home. And though the world around him had changed beyond all recognition, the most vital lesson had not. The greatest victory of that war had never been etched into treaties or carved into imposing monuments. It had been handwritten, sealed with trust, and addressed across an ocean to those who once called themselves enemies and later learned to call each other family.